I've been thinking about women I admire, and I had forgotten, and I'm sad to say that I forgot about my grandmother, Rosie Lee Jones. I'll tell you the truth. She wasn't my real grandmother, but as a kid, I was always reminded that she was not my flesh and blood. But to me, you couldn't take her away from me. She always treated me like I was of her lineage, her womb, her flesh and blood. That was my Rosie. I loved her. And I thought about her today as I lay in the bed, fighting the sunlight, nudging and urging me to get up and be a productive citizen, something I refused to be. I no longer take pleasure in being productive, being useful. I take pleasure in being. And it was a wonderful feeling to have this morning, to just lie in the bed and daydream and remember. It was like mentally I was walking through the front door of her house and I could see the TV, I could hear the music, and I could walk straight through. She had a shotgun house to the back and fuss at Roscoe to sit down and behave. And it brought me so much joy. So once I got up and I stretched and meditated because your body always reminds you when you've laid too long. And my body, now that I'm closer to 40 than I am to 30, reminds me very often that I need to move. And once I moved, I got a little hungry. So I did what any loving person would do for themselves. I made myself some breakfast. And this morning, that breakfast was in honor of Rosie. I made something I think she would have enjoyed. I cooked up some little cocktail wieners, scrambled eggs, warmed bread, and a cup of instant coffee. Here's why I say she would have enjoyed that. When I was little and I would go to visit, every morning, she always made the same thing. Bacon was special. Every blue moon we had bacon, but we normally had a can of Vienna sausages, a scrambled egg, and warmed bread. Not toast, not toasted. Just once the stove had been turned off, she would pop two slices of bread in that pan and put the lid on it and let it warm it up. And that was it. And I'm sure she did this to be to be economical. You know, we lived in the hood, but I'll tell you this. She did not live in the hood. She may have existed in the community of the hood, but she lived like a queen. Her house was like a jewel at the top of the street. When you turn the corner to get to our street, and the first house on the left side was her house. Her house was raised up in a way where if you were walking down the street, you had to look up at her. And I promise you, she was always looking down at you. Very regally, she was looking down at everyone. I know I shouldn't love it, but I did. She reminded me of a queen. She always held herself very high. She held herself to very high standards. And you had to step up a few steps to get to the walkway. And the walkway felt long because she would not greet you immediately. She would just stare at you as you walked up the walkway. And before you stepped up those steps, you had better say hello, or she was going to make sure you knew that you were rude and you were not welcome. And around that house, she had these large bushes that hid what was behind them. And so you only really saw how lovely the garden behind them was once you hit that small opening that went to the walkway of the house. And lining the walkway were all these different colors of hydrangeas, and there were always bees just buzzing everywhere. And I used to be terrified in the summer, but she always had this calm manner of reminding me that I was safe and that the bees were there because there were sweet things to be had. She had a way with words. And I would calmly walk up the walkway until I discovered that I could squeeze through the side bush. And eventually that hole grew as I grew. What started out as a small me sized hole turned into a large me sized hole until we didn't live there anymore. But I was reminded of eating those Vienna sausages as I cut into my little cocktail wieners. I was reminded of eating her scrambled eggs as I ate my scrambled eggs. And the next step in the routine after breakfast was always playing the piano. I used to think my grandmother was rich because I didn't know anyone who owned an instrument, yet she owned a full size piano, a real piano. I didn't even think black people had stuff like that, but my grandmother had stuff like that. And we would sit down and she would sit on one end of the bench and she would sit me at the other end of the bench and she would tell me what keys to play. And at this point I could almost play by ear because when we played she made sure I knew what key she touched. And sometimes I can still hear her voice singing a song that for the longest time I thought she made up. I thought she wrote this song. And one day I looked it up and I said, "Oh, that's really an old hymnal." And I could hear her plucking on those keys, going, "John was in the spirit on the Lord's day." And the way she sang it, I remember I felt like I could feel it in my very being. She was special. I don't know how I forgot how much I admired her. I used to think when I grow up, I'll have a big house like my grandmother, with a pink room like my grandmother, and I will wear large curls in my hair like my grandmother. Every blue moon, I'll put on my large curly wig like my grandmother. And I've come to realize that my favorite nail lacquer, not liqueur, though that's delicious too, is like a classic red, the same shade of red she would wear over her long nails. She was always put together, even in the house. I am amazed. I don't think I ever remember seeing my grandmother in something that wasn't pretty. Even her house dresses were pretty. They were soft shades of pink with ruffles, soft pastel blue with with lovely detailing. She even wore jewelry in the house, and she also wore lipstick, except to bed. And I remember the first time seeing her without lipstick or without her wig, and I did not know who she was. It was a funny day and a funny sight, but I love how strong she was. And I feel like at this point in my life, I'm a little more rosy than I've ever been. And honestly, that's a good place to be.